Okay, what I'm proposing to talk about today is, after discussing with Anne Harvey and others what she wanted me to cover, was not so much a rehash of bibliometric techniques or anything like that, but to talk about what is happening elsewhere in the world. What I've seen happen, some of the projects that I've been involved with most recently. And it is quite interesting because the more I go and participate in some of these projects, often overseas, I keep thinking the one phrase that continually comes to mind is reinventing the wheel. Time after time you get another group of people who ask exactly the same questions that have been asked for about the last 10 years, use exactly the same literature to answer those questions. And at times I get a little bit frustrated, but then I think, well, these people haven't been exposed to this type of information, these types of techniques, so it's almost an education process. So the three basic things I'm going to talk about are why is the use of metrics increasing? Hank's already touched on it a little bit, and I'll go and I'm planning to talk about a few more drivers of this increase. I almost called my talk The Rise of Metrics subtitle, except in the UK. So if I have time at the end of this presentation, I might talk a little bit about why the UK seems to have gone in the complete opposite direction to what most other countries are doing. We'll see how much time I've got. I'm also going to give a brief overview of two of the most recent projects that I've been involved in, which have been particularly interesting. And also talk a little bit about some of the research agencies that are capable of supporting the development of this type of analysis, because it's the one thing that concerns me more than anything. You have this proliferation of data, you have people much more readily able to access it, but do they actually know what they're working with? And I think it's incredibly important that we have research units that are able to support this increased use of metrics. Fortunately, there are a couple internationally, particularly in Europe, that are being set up and developed, so I'll talk a little bit about those as well. So, why the increase? Well, there are many reasons for the increase, and I mean, sometimes it's as simple as a government directive, which is what initially happened in the UK, where the Treasury Department decided that HEFCE was spending too much money on the research assessment exercise, it was too labour intensive, the returns on all the money that it was costing to run these exercises were not worth it, so get rid of that, let's have an assessment direct the funding based on success in competitive grant applications to the Research Council. So it was a directive without any consultation, I understand, with most of the stakeholders in this, that came top down. Now, things have moved on since then, so it was probably not a particularly useful directive. Other reasons are increased accountability requirements. We constantly hear this. But on the other side of the coin, there's also advocacy. A lot of people are finding that the use of some of this data is actually quite useful for advocating increased funding or for demonstrating outcomes to the politicians. Another reason that has been talked about quite a lot is peer review overload. And Hank mentioned in his discussion the problems in small countries, in particular in getting peer reviews on panels who can assess in great detail, that don't have biased views, or simply in a small community you keep asking the same people time after time and they have little time for their own research. The other thing that's happened, and particularly in bibliometrics, I think this is a really important change, is that we have the entry of new databases into the landscape. For 40 years we had Web of Science, 50 years, and that was it, and it was a monopoly. In the first 30 or so years, 20 years, it was run as an academic resource under Eugene Garfield, but eventually it was sold and became part of Thomson Reuters after a few iterations, and so therefore it was a commercially run product. That led to significant problems with people having access to the data, both in terms of very strict licensing agreements, but also costs. So for a time there was actually a reduction in the number of people who could actually do any decent development work on new indicators. But we have Elsevier now, a new entrant into the market. We also have the potential use of data from Google Scholar, which I'll talk a little bit about briefly. So there are new data sources entering the landscape. There's also incredible technology advances. I mean, I would be embarrassed to tell you how I used to use bibliometry, how I used to analyse the data when I first started in 1988, I think it was. So I've been going for nearly 25 years. And I won't mention how I did it because it was embarrassing. Nowadays, the capacity to do complex calculations is far easier. The other thing I'm going to touch on, particularly with one of the projects I'm going to talk about, the Canadian one, is the failure of peer review processes, and sometimes they actually do fail. It's not just that they're not perfect, but they can completely fail to provide what is required. So I've listed here 3 reviews, but in fact I'm only going to talk about 2 of them because there's considerable overlap. The first one is an OECD workshop on performance-based funding for public research in tertiary education systems. Big mouthful, but that is precisely what it is about. And it also will focus my presentation too, because what I'm talking about here is at high levels of aggregation. I'm not talking about assessment of individual researchers, which I'm very reticent myself to do. Hank's a little bit more optimistic. I'm normally an optimistic person, but I've seen the assessment, the use of metrics in the assessment of individuals misused and abused so much that I no longer am comfortable doing it. I'm not saying that it's not possible, and I think the sort of data that we bibliometricians use could be used really successfully in assisting promotions and appointments, but too often I've seen them misused and abused, and so I don't know that we can change the culture of that. So I'm going to concentrate today very much at the high level of aggregation, at research systems as a whole, maybe institution level, rather than down at the level of individuals or groups. The Canadian Academy of Health Sciences 2 or 3 years ago, I was involved in a very comprehensive overview of frameworks and indicators that will measure returns on investment in health research. And this wasn't just academic impact. They were also attempting to look at indicators or frameworks that could be used to measure the downstream impact on outcomes, health outcomes. That report is available on the website, and it is a very useful literature review. As these presentations are going to be available, I've put the URL in there, so please go to that. The most recent one I've been involved in was a really interesting one. It was for the Council of Canadian Academies. It's a report on a forthcoming report. They're currently translating it into French, so it'll be out within a month or 2 at the most, on science performance and research funding. It was chaired by Rita Colwell, who was previously head of the NSF, brought together people from Europe and America and Canada, and was particularly interesting because it was put in motion due to the failure of a peer review process. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Now, the OECD workshop, this was held, the workshop itself was held in June 2010. After that, a report was published which covered 3 commission literature reviews. These were done on models of performance-based research funding systems. This was carried out by Diana Hicks from Georgia Tech. Performance indicators that were used in these systems, and that was carried out by Hannah Foss Hansen from Denmark, and then impacts of the systems, which I undertook. The report also includes some really detailed country surveys, and the proceedings of the workshop itself comes out in the publication, which is also available online. What was particularly interesting about the OECD workshop, in addition to all it was having a really good overview of the literature, was that it brought together people from, I think, about 27 countries. And often when you're trying to research this type of information, a lot of what you're trying to get a handle on, what's happening in the rest of the world, is not available in the academic literature. It's not even available in the grey literature readily accessible online. It's locked away in government department reports that haven't been published, or alternatively, they're out there, but they're not in a language that you speak. So this brought together a lot of information that we hadn't previously had access to, or not readily. I'll do a brief overview of 2 of the literature reviews that were done. The first, by Diana, looked at the role of metrics in the different performance-based funding systems around the world. And there are various ways you can categorise this, and Diana's review, I mean, I recommend everybody to read it. It's an exceptionally good review. I chose to look at it this way, in whether it was a panel assessment or a formula-based method of research funding. So the first example is panel assessment, where it's primarily peer review, and the obvious example is the RAE. And also the replacement of the RAE, which is the Research Excellence Framework, will also primarily be a peer review process. Hong Kong follows very closely what the RAE has done, and apparently we discovered that China is doing a similar exercise. A different method is a panel assessment, where you have expert review with a central role for metrics and no pure peer review in the sense of the UK RAE. And that's what you had in Australia for ERA with the science disciplines. A third type of system is a formula-based one, where it's metrics only. You simply have a formula, you get some data, you feed it in, and you fund the universities on that basis. And Australia's current formula, based on the Herdic data collection, is one example, but lots of other countries have it. Austria, Czech Republic, Denmark, all the Scandinavian countries, Slovak Republic, and we're quite sure that there are several other countries that we weren't able to identify. Flanders and Sweden have been highlighted here. The reason being is that in all the other countries, the formula consists of the fairly standard number of publications, success in competitive grant or amount of competitive grant income, PhD students, staff data, the fairly standard, easily attainable data. In Flanders and Sweden, they also incorporate citation data into the formula calculation, so it's a slight difference. The fourth one is where you have a formula, you're still feeding data in. There's no, it's a published formula, unlike ERA, where it's the panel that comes up with the final figure. In these instances, it's still a formula. There is peer review, and the peer review outcome is fed as one number into the formula, but there are also other metrics. And New Zealand, Italy, and Poland were 2 examples where this occurs. The other thing that I was asked to look at in detail was to review the evidence on the intended and unintended consequences of all these performance-based funding systems. And I did this under several headings. The first was funding. Did it actually achieve any change in the distribution of funding? Is that what was intended, or was it an unintended consequence? The second thing was looking at a lot of the human resource issues. There's a huge amount of debate over certain aspects of human resource issues, particularly in the UK, in relation to the hiring of high-flying academics in the 6 months preceding the next RAE. There was a lot of talk in Australia when we were introducing ERA about the effects in Australia of this type of system. There's also quite a lot of discussion about the morale on researchers of this of this type of assessment system. There was a lot of discussion in New Zealand, where the assessment is based on the individual rather than more on the field or the department, as happens in other university systems. We looked at productivity. What's the effect of introducing these systems on the productivity in the tertiary education sector? On teaching, because this is focusing on the assessment of research. What is the effect on teaching and the role of teaching in academic academic workplace? There's always been a lot of discussion about the fact that many of these assessment systems focus on fields of research, and is that the most appropriate way? Does it affect the discipline mix within universities, particularly if there's a bad assessment on a particular field? We hear in the UK where some departments have closed down because they only got a 3, or in Oxford's case probably a 4. Also talk about interdisciplinary research, and is it badly affected? The focus of research. Do people go more for safe research rather than blue skies research because it's more certain that they will get fairly good returns, and they're worried about the way the assessments are done? We also looked at the effect on institutional management practices, because the introduction of some of these funding systems required quite significant changes in management practices within institutions, and I was involved in lots of discussions about where can we find a decent university information management system that will allow us to get every single bit of information out that is required by all these different assessment processes. I don't think one exists, or as far as I know it hasn't been designed yet. Talk about collaboration, the effect on collaboration and author behaviour. So these were the sorts of things that were covered. These are just the headline outcomes for the report. I really do encourage you to read it. It's not a particularly long report, but it is very comprehensive. Basically, as Henk has mentioned, the policy interest in performance-based funding for research and the use of metrics is growing almost exponentially. There are a lot of different funding models. They're not every country is going down exactly the same path. Having said that, subsequent to this particular meeting, you do find some convergence. For example, in the Scandinavian countries, they now seem nearly all of the countries converging on what's called the Swedish model, Norwegian model. And even in Sweden, which had done something quite different, there is more interest now in looking at what Norway had done. Denmark, Finland are following the Norwegian model. But there are still lots of different models across various countries. Performance indicators are varying and constantly evolving, and there certainly is significant work being done on improving the quality of the indicators that are being used. Budgetary impacts differ across countries. In some countries, these new systems result in quite significant shifts of funds. In other countries, it had virtually no impact whatsoever. Evidence-based analysis of impacts is scarce. What we found when we went through the literature review is that if you found one study that told you that interdisciplinary research was being adversely affected, you would find another study that will show that it had absolutely no effect whatsoever, and that interdisciplinary research was going on as it always had been. What we discovered with many of these studies is that they'd been carried out in some instances by people with a advocacy standpoint before they even undertook the research, so they were wanting to prove some dire consequence of the research assessment exercise or one of the other funding exercises. That the design of many of these studies was particularly poor in that any change that was seen was slated home to the performance funding system. No attempt was made to see, well, just a moment, we've got that funding exercise, another country A's got that one, country B has a separate one. They're completely different types of funding systems, but they end up with exactly the same results. So maybe it's not the funding system itself that's causing the outcome, maybe there are a lot of other drivers at work. They also tended to focus on sets of data that looked at maybe the country as a whole instead of focusing on what was happening in the higher education system. So, and that could cause, I mean, you really had to look at the underlying causes behind the changes that were being seen, and there was considerable lack of that. What the workshop recommended was that there be an increase or a support of international comparative studies on the impact, that this would really help in determining whether particular outcomes were a result of one type of research assessment system, or whether that this was just a general trend that was happening worldwide. Unfortunately, I don't know that there's much actual work being done. The rhetoric was there. Every country said, yes, we support this, but I'm only seeing one or two studies recently that have started to do this international comparison. And when they do it, it's extremely useful. I'm just getting a 10-minute call, so I won't spend too much longer on that, but you saw in the previous slide that the website for that report is out. The Canadian study that is nearing its completion was, from my perspective, an interesting one, not so much from the discussion that went on in the workshop, in the committee meetings, because they tended to cover the same old ground, but it was why it occurred. NSERC, Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council, it funds people and programs in natural science and engineering in the tertiary education sector, primarily universities, but also some technology institutes. Its flagship scheme is the Discovery Grants Program, similar to the main ARC, NH and MRC project grant schemes, though slightly different success rate than the ARC and NH and MRC has. It has a 70% success rate. The non-Canadians on the committee were somewhat gobsmacked by that. To enable NSERC to respond to changes in the research environment, a budget reallocation process was introduced in 1994 for this program, which was its core program. This was designed to shift funding between its 12 main disciplines. It had 12 disciplines and sub-disciplines under this. The reallocation was done at the discipline level. And they wanted to be able to respond to changes. So when nanotechnology comes, they wanted to be able to put more money across into that. It was a peer review process that they set up, purely peer review, with, I presume, some metrics that were provided to the panels looking at it, but it was a peer review process. Basically, it failed. It did not reallocate any money, or virtually none. In 2007, an evaluation of the process basically said it had high costs for no outcome. NSERC then decided that it therefore needed a metrics-based approach, and the Council of the Canadian Academies, this is an interesting governance perspective. It's very similar to Australia's National Academies Forum, but it has more capacity to undertake significant studies, and so each year it has 5 studies that it undertakes using commission staff and setting up committees. And the government commissioned CCAE to undertake a review of existing practice in metrics-based approaches to funding distributions. It's sort of slightly widened. It was basically being done for NSERC, but it slightly widened the remit to make it a little bit more inclusive. But it was still focused on budget reallocation of natural sciences and engineering, which actually made the task a lot easier because we didn't have to look at the social sciences and humanities. I won't read all the questions, you'll be able to see them on the slides, but basically, as I said, it's all about budget allocation, natural sciences and engineering, and how can you use metrics to do what peer review failed to do. Now, I had to clear these 2 slides with the CCA before I came today. I'm not at liberty to tell you what the outcome of our deliberations were, but the report, which is currently being translated in French, should be out within the next month or 2, so I suggest keep an eye on the website because there are some quite interesting there's some quite interesting information in there, including they went to about 10 countries and had very detailed discussions with what was happening in various countries around the world, and so there's a good overview. But if there's going to be a proliferation of research assessment that's using these quantitative indicators, what we desperately need is to have the right sort of support for the development of these metrics. And I've listed here some of the units that are currently working in this area. I haven't been fully comprehensive. I've listed CWTS, which of course is Hank's old unit, which was the world leader. Still is, perhaps just, but there's a new kid on the block, and I'd like to talk a little bit about them. There are several university units that are quite active in this area. There are also some government funding agency research units that have been set up, and I've listed just a couple of those, but IFQ, the first one, is one that I'm going to talk a little bit more about because they're a recent introduction and they're doing some really interesting work. I was fortunate to spend a month with them earlier this year. Actually, I shouldn't complain about Canberra weather because when I was catching a train in Berlin in January, it was -17, so Canberra's not so bad. There are some government agencies that have been set up specifically to provide data for performance review funding schemes, but they have a very narrow focus on what they're trying to do, but still sometimes come up with some quite interesting developments. You have a couple of private enterprise, companies, Evidence Limited, which was the only player in the UK for many, many years. Science Metrics, which is somewhat different. It's a Canadian company by a young ex-University of Montreal researcher, Eric Archibald, who has actually maintained much closer links to the research community than Jonathan Adams did from Evidence Limited. So they're doing a lot of contract work, but some very interesting development work as well. You also have Elsevier, Thomson Reuters and Google, who within their own organisations are doing some work. I'll just quickly mention IFQ because it's funded in part by the DFG. It has strong links to a number of the University of Bielefeld, the Fraunhofer Institute at Karlsruhe, and whilst their remit is to provide support for the DFG in assessing the work the DFG funds, they're actually a lot broader than that. That's only a small proportion of their work. And they're a very multidisciplinary team. There are about 30 researchers in the unit, which has now moved to Berlin. It's really quite stimulating to go there and work with these new young people who are extremely enthusiastic about what they're doing. And as you can see, it's not just about bibliometrics, it's about the whole research landscape. They're looking at governance, they're looking at peer review, they're looking at young researchers and careers, and they're also starting to establish summer schools in various things. So keep your eye on the IFQ website if you're interested in new developments in this area, because there's some really interesting work coming out, some fascinating studies. My last slide is a couple of pleas, and I think this might resonate with some people, and I think Hank has touched on a couple of them. The first is to use a balanced approach to research assessment. So often I hear it being a case of it's peer review or it's metrics. It doesn't need to be peer review or metrics, it really should be peer review with metrics. The combination of the two is where you really get strength, you can really enhance assessments. And it doesn't have to be a choice of either or. In fact, it shouldn't be a choice of either or. Use professional bibliometric techniques and analysts and avoid amateur bibliometrics or bibliometricians. Anybody who knows what the definition of a citation or a publication is seems to think that they can go into Google Scholar or Web of Science and come up with a figure that proves something. Most don't understand the strengths and weaknesses of the underlying data. They don't understand how you have to have some sort of benchmark to compare yourself to. The fact that you can get 250 sites for a paper out of Google Scholar versus 120 for the same paper out of Scopus does not mean that Google Scholar is better. It just means that everybody else is going to have big numbers too. And I think what we have to do, or what I, again, a plea, is to support the conduct of independent, evidence-based, multinational research projects that investigate the impacts of all these forms of research assessment, that you really do need to put some money into looking at the evidence out there and not just using some of the advocacy that is put forward, some of the rhetoric that appears in the popular press, which is actually not based on any true evidence. So on those three concluding pleas, I'll finish.